Well, today we're going to begin a new series. It's going to be called In the Grip of Grace, and it's on the book of Romans. The book of Romans is a book that in the 28 years that I've been pastoring, 28 years, that sounds like I'm old. In the 28 years that I've been pastoring, I have never preached an entire series through the book of Romans. In fact, I've only preached a couple of sermons on Romans because there's only a couple of passages that we're most familiar with. Because Romans is a long work. It's about 16 chapters long, and it's Paul wrote it. It's his longest work. It's kind of circuitous. Paul talks in circles, and he stands still and he talks around himself, and then he talks around himself. And, it just kind of is hard to understand. It's very theological. It can be misunderstood. And so I thought, it would be really fun to dig into the book of Romans. And it's kind of scary all at the same time because, there's a lot that can be misunderstood in this passage. And so that we're going to begin that today. We'll set it aside next week when Bob's here, sharing about his kindness journey, and then we'll pick it back up after that. And it's going to take us well into the fall to go. We're not doing chapter by chapter, but we'll do sections of chapters. I've broken it down into, I think it takes us into November. So, got to talk about something. Why not talk about Romans? It's the most lengthy work that the Apostle Paul did that we have recorded for us in Scriptures. It is a writing that he wrote to the church in Rome. It is a church that he did not start. Often the letters that Paul writes are to churches that he started, and he's wanting to give them guidance and correct them. And this is a letter to a church in Rome that he didn't start to encourage it in its faithfulness. Romans is considered Paul's masterpiece. At the time he wrote it, there were about 100 Christians in a city, Rome, of about 1 million people. 100 Christians in a city of 1 million people. And so you can see there's plenty of work for an evangelist like Paul to do in that city to share the good news. At issue that he is addressing throughout this letter is the spread of the good news of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. Jesus came to the Jews first, and people began to follow Jesus and understand who Jesus was and what he was about. And Christianity became a religion, a way of life. And the struggle was for how it played out in people who weren't of Jewish background. And they had these laws and rules and regulations, and they had to navigate, do we impose those laws, rules, and regulations on people who weren't Jewish? And how do we navigate that? And so I think it has a lot to say to us in our time. And so buckle up and we'll explore it together. Robert Weber, who is a theologian, he's a seminary professor, he's a writer, he once said that at one point in his life, Christianity was no longer a power to be experienced, but a system to defend. And the more certain I became about my ability to defend God's existence and explain his character, the less real he seemed to me. That's a powerful quote. I want to read it again so that you can understand it. Robert Weber says Christianity was, at one point in his life, Christianity was no longer a power to be experienced, but a system to be defended. And the more certain I became about my abilities to defend God's existence and explain his characteristics, the less real he seemed to me. You get what he's saying? Some powerful stuff. Now, Paul writes in Romans 1:16 and 17, "For I am not ashamed of the good news about Christ. It is the good news." Let me start over. "I am not ashamed of the good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and then the Gentile. This good news tells us how God makes us right in his sight. This is accomplished from start to finish by faith. As the scriptures say, it is through faith that a righteous person has life." I'm struggling this morning. I think that Robert Weber is right. We have made Christianity less about the power of God experienced in our lives and more about a system to be defended. On Thursday, I don't know if you know it or not, but it was National Day of Prayer. And here in Salisbury, we had a breakfast at the Civic Center that you could have attended in the morning. And there was a prayer gathering at noon on the steps of the government office building. And I went to neither. In fact, at noon, I went with Courtney, not with her. I didn't know it was her, but we were both at Acorn Market, and they have the best sweet potato sliders. They put their chicken salad on sweet potato biscuit, and it is out of the world, and this is a Thursday special, and it's worth going downtown, and it's really worth missing the prayer gathering for, and that's what I did. And as I drove by, I saw all these people out on the steps, and I was like, what in the world is this? And so I had my lunch, and I walked out of Acorn Market, and I saw somebody who's a city employee who I've worked with quite closely in the last 3 years. She was walking her dog, and so I said to her, hey, what's going on in the government office building? I forgot, what it was. And she said, well, I think it's the National Day of Prayer. Oh, you're right. And I said, yeah, and there was a gathering this morning at the Civic Center, and I didn't go to that, and I try to steer clear of those kind of things. And she looked at me like I had two heads. And she said to me, really? I didn't expect to hear you say that. And I said, well, I'm glad you didn't. But let me tell you, this is the conversation I had with her. I said to her, it was a lengthy conversation then. I shared my feelings about why I steer clear of the National Day of Prayer. First reason is because it often focuses on the supposed supremacy of the United States of America. God loves the whole world, and we're not any more special than anybody else. Secondly, it is often a box to check off for people who attend it. And I don't need a little star by my name, or I don't need to check a box. Thirdly, it's often long on talk and little on powerful work together. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to say the church should come together and be together and do things together. And we talk about it every time. I've been to some of those National Day of Prayer breakfasts. And we talk about how the church should be united, and yet then we go out of that building and we go our merry way, and we don't say anything to anybody else until the next National Day of Prayer gathering. And you know me, I believe the church should work together. I mean, look at us. We're working together with the church next door and two churches that, a Seventh-day Adventist church and a Missouri Synod Lutheran church and a cooperative Baptist church. We work together with those guys, and we love them. And we say when we work together, it's just Jesus. And it's beautiful, and that's what God wants. It's all these rules and regulations that divide us and separate us, and that shouldn't be. And I don't have time of day to pretend and hear the talk if we're not going to do it. And so that I told my friend that. And then I said, many times the speaker rails on about how we need to defend and protect Christianity from the evils encroaching on it by our culture. And I just want to raise my hand and say, well, wait a minute. We brought all of that on ourselves because the way we bring Jesus with our Bibles as weapons and beat people upside the head, and we don't show the love, we don't show up with the love of Jesus when we bring him to an event. We spew hate and we put people down and we push people aside. No wonder our culture doesn't want anything to do with Jesus. I don't want anything to do with that Jesus either. And so my friend got more than she thought she was going to get. And in the words of Robert Weber, Christianity has become a system to defend rather than a power to experience. My city worker friend is not active in a local church and very likely has not had positive encounters with people of faith. So I concluded by saying to her, I would much rather spend my time tangibly sharing the love of Jesus than sitting around talking about it. And you could tell that I had piqued her interest because she didn't expect to have any of that conversation that day when she met me on the sidewalk. Paul says, "For I'm not ashamed of the good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and then the Gentile." The struggle that Paul was working at in Romans is the spread of the good news to the Gentiles. And the struggle involved letting go of all of those rules and regulations and laws that they felt they had to honor in order to be a faithful follower. And the struggle also included embracing God's love and grace and the power of that in their lives. That was a struggle. Because the Jews believed that they were a favored people and that they were better than others and that they were worthy of God's love and grace in a way that if you weren't a Jew, you weren't worthy of God's love and grace. And so the struggle was helping others to experience the power of God's grace and love in their lives. Now, I'm going to talk about what happened to me last week in a couple of settings. And as I do that, I'm not trying to elevate myself. I'm just wanting to show you how it can happen in your life too. And I want you to be thinking as you hear me talk about the way I experience the opportunities God provided. Think about the opportunities God provides for you in the course of a week, because He does. Just last week, I had frequent opportunities to tell the story of God's power at work within and through me and through us as a congregation. And I get to do it in places where you wouldn't normally think that a pastor gets to do it. I didn't get invited to speak at the podium of the National Day of Prayer, but I got invited to speak into people's lives in a variety of settings. I don't have to stand on a street corner and shout out at people. I just have to open myself up to the power of God at work in my life and through my life, and the opportunities present themselves one right after another, after another, after another. On Tuesday night, the county council had a meeting. It was a contentious meeting. I had gotten an email from the Greater Salisbury Committee leadership and the Chamber of Commerce. They were organizing a bunch of community leaders to come in and talk about the county executive's proposed budget and the lack of funding for education. In the state of Maryland, there's something called maintenance of effort funding, and that means that we kind of give to education the bare minimum. They're required to give what they gave last year and not a penny more. And so our education people, Dr. Hanlon, the superintendent, asked for significant funding because when she came 2 years ago, she listened for a year, and then she articulated a plan of ways to make our educational system in Wicomico County all the better. And she has 3 points to that, and it costs money to change those points. And see, one of the things that's happening is when Purdue or the PRMC or Salisbury University, some of our big employers in town, bring somebody in and they have children, they want to know, okay, well, where am I going to send my kids to school? And they start investigating Wicomico County schools, and they say, whoa, wait a minute, we're going to go live in Worcester, and we're going to take our kids to Worcester County and put them in school there because they got better schools. Well, they got better schools because they fund it better. And so there was this whole movement in the budget hearing to talk about, and leader after leader after leader got up. And so I went, and I got there just a little bit early. They hadn't opened the doors to let any of us in the chamber. And I got there, and Dr. Hanlon, the school superintendent, who I know and have worked with, was there. And she got up and came over and shook my hand and thanked me for coming and said, I appreciate your support. And she thanked me again on the way out. And then I saw her on Wednesday at Parkside. and at a planting thing that they have at the greenhouse there, because they get special seeds that they're testing. The company's testing, and Parkside is one of 2 places in the whole country that gets to plant these seeds and try how they are. And it's a big thing. And my friend Jerry Kelly, who runs that, invited me to come. And so I went to support him. And Dr. Hanlon was there, and she walks up to me as I'm walking in, and she shakes my hand and she says, "Wow, 2 times in less than 24 hours, I get to see you." And you see, there's a connection that God made. And it's really cool, because as we walked out of the Tuesday night council meeting, this dude, who I know as Bob Souza is his name, he is the head of the Wicomico County Public School System facilities. I met him when I first started pitching the idea of growing vegetables at Parkside. I met him again in January as we handed off our homeless shelter guest to St. Peter's, because they were the next people in line to take the shelter after us, after our 2 weeks. And Bob Souza was the head of their St. Peter's shelter. And so he said, "Hey," and we reconnected, and we talked about the gardens, and we talked about shelters, and then we became Facebook friends. And he's seen recently how I've been in the public schools 4 times in 2 weeks. I was in 4 different schools talking about the garden. I was invited by the Word Museum. These are the opportunities God provides to talk about my faith and to share as a pastor who I am and why we're doing what we're doing. And so Bob says, "Hey, Martin," Tuesday night as we're leaving, we're walking out the door. He says, "Hey, Martin," he says, "I've seen your posts about the things you're doing in the school system recently." I said, "Yeah, Bob, I really want to have a hoop house in each school system and a garden opportunity, hands-on learning environment." He said, "When I watch what you're doing, it gets my juices flowing." His background's horticulture. He says, he got out his card and gave it to me. And he says, "I want you to call me this week and set up a time so we can get together and make a plan to have your vision become reality and have hoop houses and gardens in each elementary school in the county." That's a God thing, brothers and sisters. It's huge. And then on Thursday, I'm sitting, minding my own business, doing some study for this sermon, and Gary Betters calls. Now, Gary's on his way to New York to be with family because his aunt died last week, and he's going to support his uncle and to be with his brothers and sisters as they support the uncle. And so he calls and he says, "Hey, Martin, guess what happened before I left school?" He said, "So-and-so came up to me and she said," and Gary works at Choices Academy, and Choices Academy is not a regular school. It's an alternative school. It's where students who can't get along in the regular school system go until they can get rehabilitated and ready to go back. I don't know. I'm not using the right language, but anyhow, that's kind of what it is. You get the point. So Gary said, one of the tasks we have is to help these kids deal with better social skills. And so this person came up to me and said, "Hey, Gary, I really think we ought to put a garden at our school. We have lots of ground. They have a new location. They're building a new school. I really would like to have a garden here because I think a garden would provide a great opportunity for these students to learn social interaction in a way that they resist and they hate the way we try to do it in the classroom." And Gary said, "I know I don't have to tell you all that. You already know all that. You know all the benefits." And I said, "Gary, your timing is really cool." And I told him about meeting with Bob Souza on Tuesday and that we're going to meet next week. And I said, the timing is just impeccable. And that's God, brothers and sisters. There's no other way. I'm not ashamed of this good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work. And then this week, I emailed Mayor Jake Day and said, "Hey, can the city help us out with a dump truck?" The 2 gardens, Camden Community and Boundless Community, needed about 12 yards of compost. I can get 1.5 yards in my truck. Figure out how many trips that is. It's a lot. The guy who I get the compost from got rid of his dump truck, and he doesn't have a dump trailer anymore. And so I was starting to feel like I had to do that in my truck. So I emailed Jake and said, "Hey, Jake, can the city help me out? Can we use the city dump truck? It'll take 2 trips. It'll take a morning. It's out on Snow Hill Road." And he emailed me back Sunday afternoon after he had seen the posts of the ways in which we were being a blessing to the city by sending a crew to the city park to pick up trash after the marathon, and by putting those medallions at the storm drains, those 2 things that we did last week. He emailed me back and said, "Yes, Martin, we can do that. I'll call Tom and set it up." So Tom called me on Monday and said, "We'll get it to you on Wednesday." And sure enough, 2 dump trucks loads showed up, 1 at each garden, and we are grateful. They see the power of God at work in and through us, and they're partners with us. Since when does the city partner with the church? Friday, I was at the Ward Museum and got to present the Camden Community Garden to a whole bunch of parents and kids that had an end of the year celebration from the STREAM program that I'd presented from. And then in 2 weeks, I've been invited to be at SU for a community fair that they're having, where I'll get to display the beauty of the work that the church does, because we're not ashamed of the gospel. Monday night, in your announcement sheet, I didn't highlight earlier because I knew I was going to do it now, at Salisbury University, 5:30 to 7 p.m., Holloway Hall, Dr. Stock, Tim Stock, who's a garden neighbor who I wouldn't have met if we hadn't done the garden down there, is doing a Why Does God Matter event. He's a philosophy professor. This semester, he's had his philosophy students exploring things of faith. He asked myself, Mayor Day, and several other pastors to come in and be interviewed by him. He recorded it. It was anonymous, that the students got to work with the case studies in an anonymous way, although he said that some of them had figured out who I was. Can you guess how? And they figured out who Mayor Day was in the case study. And, again, can you guess how? He was talking about ways we live out our faith, and we were talking about that. And so on Monday night, they're having a wrap-up. Unfortunately, I made a commitment to Pinehurst, and I need to go there, but I'm going to go for the very introduction of this. And it's an exciting thing to get people in our community, a public school, talking about, why does God matter? I don't know what kind of conclusions they're going to come to, but at least they're having a conversation. It's exciting. I'm not ashamed of this good news, writes Paul about Christ. It is the power of God at work. And last Sunday, it was a beautiful day. We did our Be a Blessing Sunday first. We cancel services and go out into the community and do things here that go out into the community. And then we did Joy Fest, and we had a phenomenal crowd at Joy Fest. The Pinehurst Choir showed. All but 2 students in the choir came and brought their families. They didn't wear their Community of Joy Pinehurst Choir shirts because they thought they were coming to church. I don't know how they missed that. That's why they were dressed up. But anyhow, that's why they didn't. And so after that day, after they sang, the vice principal, Kevin Smith, came up to me and said, Martin, this is really incredible how many families and students from Pinehurst you got here. And I said, dude, it's just because we invited the choir. And then that Thursday before last Thursday, a week ago, Thursday, we had a reading night for first grade in the garden. And we had 104 people signed up to come on Tuesday night. We changed it because of rain. It ended up having over 75 people come on the change night. And it was such a powerful experience. He said to me, this is the vice principal, Kevin Smith, saying to me after that experience on Sunday, he said, Martin, he said, the next time we do a PTA, I think we ought to do it at the church. I'm like, really? Have you gone in and seen how small our building is? He said, dude, have you come to PTA? We have 6 to 8 people. I said, well, what do you think? Why do you think people would come here? He said, well, they came to the garden and they came to Joy Fest. Maybe if you invite them and you say you're going to serve them something, do some kind of hospitality. And I'm like, wow, that's really a cool idea. When has the church ever hosted a PTA? I don't ever know of that. And again, it's not because we're pushing. We're just not ashamed of who Jesus is, and we're showing up with him on our sleeves, and we're sharing his love in ways of that are beautiful. Not unlike some pastors that you might have seen in the news this week. And I'm going to leave it there. We can talk about it later in the talkback time. But, we're doing some beautiful work here in this community. We're sowing seeds that make an impact and a difference in the lives of people. I am not ashamed of the good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work. Brennan Manning, who's an author, says the greatest cause of atheism in Christians It is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and then walk out the door and deny him with their lifestyles. Henry Blackaby says something similar. He says, our gospel is canceled by the way we live. I'm not ashamed of this good news about Christ, says Paul. It is the power of God at work. This good news, says Paul, tells us how God makes us right in his sight. Fred Craddock, who's a renowned preacher who's now deceased, tells this story. He says, I was asked to speak at a big church convention of a major denomination in Las Vegas. Why Vegas? I don't know. I went out the hotel to hail a cab to take me to the convention center where the gathering was being held, and I told the cab, I got in and told the cabbie where I wanted to go, and he said, is that where all these preachers are going? I said, yes. And the cabbie said, I want to tell you, don't try to convert me. I'm a Christian and I go to church regularly with my family. And the Craddock said, I just want to ride to the convention center. And then the cabbie said, I've already had 4 people this morning try to convert me. And I'm tired of it. And it's funny, but it's not funny. Because it gives a black eye to the church, to the beauty of what we do. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of this good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work. Yes, brothers and sisters, God is at work all around us. He's constantly extending his love and grace into the lives of people, even people who we look at and say, oh, they're not worthy. You don't say that, right? I mean, because we know here at Community of Joy that all of our lives are messy, but we're beloved by God, and that makes us a beloved mess. And that's not just us, that's everybody. You see, God's constantly extending his love and grace into the lives of people, and he wants us to join him in that work. He doesn't want us to show up with our Jesus club. He just wants us to show up with Jesus' love and grace. And in these first 17 verses of Romans, we see how Paul sets about that task of joining God in the beautiful work of restoration. Paul talks about praying day and night. Paul says he prays for the church to be effective in its work. He prays that the power of God would be experienced by those outside the church. So let's pray without ceasing, that God's power would work in and through our lives as we tangibly demonstrate God's love and grace to others. Secondly, Paul says, Paul lets God work. He recognizes that God has a role that he doesn't have. It's not our role to judge others. We've talked about this again and again. So too, we should let God work, not try to do his work for him. And we too should open our own eyes and watch for those places where God is working and join him in that work in those places. It has been exciting this spring to see how many of us here in this congregation have joined me in the garden and are engaging in the garden, and not just about the task of gardening, but to come and visit with neighbors and play with children. On Thursday night, Caroline and Emma came, and it was really cool. Caroline has developed a relationship with a couple of kids that have been coming here from the garden, and she whisked them away and started playing with them and allowed their mom to engage in a way that she wouldn't have been able to do had Caroline not done that. And then Emma, the second grade teacher at Pinehurst Elementary School, knew some of the students and was able to invite them in and include them in this task, because we want to be teaching children. And it's just beautiful to see the ways in which we share the love of Jesus by welcoming and being hospitable and meeting people where they are. One more very important thing we learn from the first 17 verses of Romans 1 is we learn that we can learn from each other. Paul says in verse 12, when we get together, I want to encourage you in your faith, but I also want to be encouraged by yours. You see, what he's saying there, brothers and sisters, is something that we in the church need to recognize, and that is we don't have the corner market on faith. Other people have experiences of God, and we need to allow them to share that with us and encourage us in our faith as we share with them and encourage them in their faith. It's a two-way street. We can learn from each other. When we demonstrate an openness to learn from others, they become more open to learning from us, and the relationship gets all the deeper. I want to conclude in this way. A young Jewish boy was living in a small Polish village when he and all the other Jews in the vicinity were rounded up by the Nazi troops and sentenced to death. The boy joined his neighbors in digging a shallow ditch for their own graves. This is a true story. Then they were lined up against a wall and machine gunned. Their corpses fell into the shallow grave, and the Nazis covered the bodies with dirt. But none of the bullets hit the little boy. His naked body was splattered with blood, the blood of his parents, and as he fell into the ditch, he pretended to be dead. The grave was so shallow and the dirt so thin that it didn't prevent him from breathing. Several hours later, when he recognized that it was dark, this young boy crawled out of the grave with blood and dirt caked to his body and made his way to the nearest home and begged for help. A woman answered the door, and immediately she recognized him as one of the Jewish boys marked for death by the Nazis. So she screamed at him to go away and slammed the door in his face. Dirty, bloody, and shivering, this little boy limped from one house to the next begging for help, but he always got the same response. People were afraid to help. Finally, in desperation, he knocked on a door, and just before the lady of the house could tell him to leave, he cried out, "Don't you recognize me? I'm the Jesus you say you love." And the lady froze in her tracks for what seemed like an eternity. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she threw open her arms, picked up the boy, and brought him inside to safety. Brothers and sisters, I am not ashamed of the good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work in and through us as we show up with Jesus wherever we are. Thanks be to God for the good news of Jesus Christ.